So this Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois debate is complex, but we're going to try to work through it in some ways that'll be useful for us, in some ways that'll be helpful for us. So the first part of the handout, bio, this middle part was really trying to lay their philosophies next to each other and sort of see what they might prioritize or de-emphasize. Right? Particularly think about the questions, how do you respond to the race problem? How do you respond to Jim Crow? That's essentially the problem that I would argue they're answering. And then the last part are some key quotes to sort of illustrate what each figure believed based on what they sort of said and wrote, these sorts of things. Lastly, there are going to be some other questions thinking about how this debate between two men gets expanded upon, gets developed, particularly by African American women. And others. We're going to see how others like Marcus Garvey, for example, also expand this debate in some interesting ways. So again, their backgrounds, first and foremost, talked about Mr. Booker T. Washington being born a slave. I think that's significant, right? That's significant. That is going to impact your view on any number of things. Right? The fact that he was literally born the property of someone else. The first line of his autobiography, first page of his autobiography, talking about his sort of origins in slavery are really, really interesting. He does a lot of interesting things in this text. This is one copy of it. This is a book called Three Negro Classics. It actually is a copy of Booker T. Washington's book, From Slavery, Souls of Black Folk, W.B. Du Bois' most famous book, and a third book called The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man by James Weldon Johnson, all in one book for about $5. It's a good value if you ever want to take that out. But in terms of Washington, he's writing a slave narrative. Essentially what Up From Slavery is a slave narrative, but it's one written after slavery ends. This comes out in 1901. This book comes out in 1901, but it really, in many ways, mirrors a lot of the earlier slave narratives that people might be familiar with, like Frederick Douglass's narrative, which is very important for abolitionist purposes. Now, the slave narratives themselves are a whole sort of genre of literature, and in part, what made them so significant was the story that they told. The story that they told was designed for a certain audience. So keep this question of audience in mind. Who are you talking to? Sometimes that may change the message that you put out there, not for better or for worse. You can decide on how you feel about that, but think about audience in terms of what you're saying or selling or marketing. A lot of times this debate comes up today. We talk about something like hip-hop culture, right? Hip-hop as this sort of organic culture that develops from within African American and Caribbean communities, right? But most people that consume or purchase hip-hop are not African American. I think the largest demographic for hip-hop for some time has been young white male teenagers. So does that change the message? If you want to sell 1 million records, do you change what you might say otherwise? Maybe some do. Some say, no, I'm just going to, put out what I would put out anyway. If it sells, it sells. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But when we think about a market for things, right, especially when money gets involved, sometimes things will change. Again, you can decide how you feel about that. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it just realistic? But think about even this contemporary debate in light of this previous debate. First, words of Mr. Booker T. Washington's autobiography. He says, I was born a slave on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. I am not quite sure of the exact place or exact date of my birth. I don't even know when I was born. I don't even know what my birthday is. I don't know exactly where. So think about this in the context of being a self-made man. 1901, this guy is now the most famous African-American person in the United States. I mean, one reason why this book becomes a bestseller. He says, I'm not quite sure the exact place or the exact date of my birth, but at any rate, I suspect I must have been born somewhere and at some time. As nearly as I have been able to learn, I was born near a crossroads post office called Hales Ford, and the year was 1858 or 1859. I do not know the month or the day. The earliest impressions I can now recall are of the plantation and the slave quarters, the latter being the part of the plantation where the slaves had their cabins. My life had had its beginning in the midst of the most miserable, desolate, and discouraging surroundings. This was so, however, not because my owners were especially cruel, for they were not, as compared with many others. I was born in a typical log cabin about 14 by 16. In this cabin, I lived with my mother and a brother and sister till after the Civil War, when we were all declared free. So he's going to get his freedom at age 8 or 9, like he said last time. Of my ancestry, I know almost nothing. In the slave quarters and even later, I heard whispered conversations among the colored people of the tortures which the slaves, including, no doubt, my ancestors on my mother's side, suffered in the middle passage of the slave ship while being conveyed to America. I have been unsuccessful in securing any information that would throw any accurate light upon the history of my family beyond my mother. She, I remember, had a half-brother and a half-sister. Even in those first couple of paragraphs, I think he does some important things. Again, think about the audience, which is going to be mostly white America at this time, particularly an audience of wealthy Northerners, like industrialists, which this book is going to reach, going to get him tremendous capital in order to build Tuskegee. This book was actually a bestseller, and white mothers in the North would read this book to their white children. They think, why? Why are they reading a book about some slave? Now, if you're a white mother in New England, why would you sit down around a fireplace and read this book to your children? What do you think? Why might this be a bestseller, particularly to an audience that seems to have nothing to do with Mr. Booker T. Washington? Why would a white mother read this to her children? Any guesses? You think?
It might have been an inspiration to them.
Yeah, it's inspirational. I mean, look at this kid. He started off with absolutely nothing. He doesn't even know what his name is. His name, Booker T. Washington, in some ways is a creation. He heard rumors that his father was named Washington Taliaferro. And so he, as sort of kids do, say, okay, well, I only had the name Booker. He only had the name Booker throughout his early schooling days and says, well, I need a last name too. So my father was named Washington Taliaferro. I must be Booker Taliaferro Washington. He kind of reverses the order. Creates himself. In a very real way, he's going to create himself. His story is remarkable if you think about it. Born in slavery, gets freed at 8 or 9 years of age, is going to work hard, right, get educated, literally pull himself up by his bootstraps, and become this fabulous African-American leader and very powerful African-American leader. Now, part of what we can talk about is how he might use this power. Some people later on, some critics are going to have problems with how he decides to use this power. But the story itself is remarkable. It's an American story. Hard work pays off. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The American dream. Just work hard, you'll be rewarded. In this case, it happens to be a young black kid that's telling the story, young former slave. So, yeah, I can imagine white mothers reading this to their children like, look, you complain about the fact that we, are maybe don't have every resource, or maybe we're not wealthy. Look at this guy. He worked hard. He pulled himself up by his bootstraps. For our purposes, we want to consider that, how this message is going to be received, especially in mainstream America. Also, how it's received in African America. Booker T. Washington is this really, really complicated figure. He's truly beloved in the African American community at this time. If you walked into an African American home in 1901, you saw a picture of Jesus, a picture of Abraham Lincoln, a picture of Booker T. Washington. That was the three you would see. Later on, you would see Martin Luther King. Some people had John F. Kennedy. But Lincoln, the great emancipator, this idea, that. Jesus, of course, and the significance of that. And Booker T, as this kind of savior of the race in a sense. Booker T is also widely hated, in part because of how he's going to use his power. So we'll talk about both of those things. But think about this idea of the self-made man. The self-made man, how very American that is in a sense. So the bio sort of talks about some of this, right? Born the son of a slave mother and white father. There are rumors about his parentage and all these sorts of things, but he really has to create himself. That's kind of the point of this. Really, he has to create himself. I'm going to argue that this autobiography that he writes, as the paper prompt says, is a political autobiography, meaning that it's written for a political purpose, and it's written with a certain audience in mind. Why do I say that? Well, even in that first page I read, does he sound like a really bitter, angry former slave to you? Sound pissed off? No. And this is actually, most of the text sounds that way. Kind of surprising. If I had been formerly enslaved, now I sort of pull myself and made it, and I write this best-selling book, it probably would say some other stuff, like how bad slavery was, right? How bad racism is. I talk about your masters, these sorts of things. First thing he does is sort of apologize for it, but they weren't as bad as some others. It's going to be really interesting how forgiving this book is on slavery, when most slave narratives have gone the other direction, right? Most Frederick Douglass's narrative, for example, 1845, the most famous slave narrative, talks tremendously about the violence of slavery. It talks about his mother and female relatives and others, women being beaten while pregnant, all these sorts of things, and kind of talks about his gaining freedom in some ways because of that violence. Washington's narrative is the exact opposite. It's very forgiving. In fact, he goes the other direction with this book. If you read it, some of the stuff might feel a little funny. He talks pretty bad about the African American community in this book. Like the whole started from the bottom joke I was making last time. He says black people didn't start from the bottom. Right? They tried to move too quickly. Right? He says they wanted to put the bottom rail on top. They wanted to be governor before they could really read and pay their bills. Black people are dirty. They need to clean themselves up before they be respected. These kind of things are like, ooh. Very, very forgiving. He says in one point, slavery was good. Like, what? Slavery was a good thing for African Americans. He says it taught them how to work, taught them the value of work. He says it made white people lazy. If you can make somebody else do all the hard work and you just kind of sit on the porch drinking mint julep or whatever, that's going to hurt you, he says. He says it's going to mess with your morals, having this much power. Again, in some ways you can maybe understand that argument, but think about how this is going to be received by an audience. So this is part of why I say this is a political autobiography. He's writing these things with a certain purpose in mind. Since the 1970s, when one of Washington's biographers exposed some new information, we've learned even more about Booker T. Washington. In many ways, it seems he had a public face, and he had some private thoughts. Right? He had a plan. He says, in order to get this plan, I'm going to do what I need to do. So maybe this book is a hustle of some type, we could argue. We'll talk more about that. But again, this sounded funny when he's making sort of racist jokes in some places, when he's talking about blacks as being uneducated and dirty. I think a lot of folks, you could see how they might be kind of taken aback by much of that. But it works. It makes this a bestseller. Whites, especially powerful, wealthy whites, read this and say, this guy has the plan for dealing with the Southern race problem. Write him a check. That's exactly what they do. They start writing checks and sending them to Booker T. Washington. It gets to the point where you can't get a job as an African American person anywhere in the country. Any sort of job without a letter from Booker T. Washington. Booker T. says, nah, that's not good. You won't get the job. In fact, that happens to Du Bois. When Du Bois wanted to be assistant superintendent of schools here in Washington, D.C., around 1905 or so. First, Booker T. says, yeah, I'll write you a letter. But in between, Souls of Black Folk comes out. Du Bois and others become critics of Washington, and Washington says, nah, that guy's not a good, Du Bois doesn't get the job. If you wrote an article, a bad article about Booker T. Washington or Tuskegee or his model of industrial education, you come to work on Monday morning and your newspaper was closed. He'd write a check and buy it, close it up, have you put out of business. Ruthless with some of his power. But from his perspective, he said, look, I have the plan for helping the entire African-American population, the entire imagined community, if you want to use that. Anybody that criticizes that is an enemy. They should be destroyed, basically. They're getting in the way of this progress. So he believes he has the solution for the race problem, how to help African-Americans survive this era of Jim Crow, and was not willing to sort of hear anybody else in terms of their dissenting opinions. Keep that in mind. Think about what you think about that. Another reason I say this, maybe this is a political autobiography. This book, Up From Slavery, is autobiography. This was not his first attempt at an autobiography. Up From Slavery comes out in 1901. It was partially ghostwritten by a white minister that was sort of favorable to these things and sort of helps him craft it in a way that is going to reach this audience. So it was not his first attempt. A year or two before, he had come out with another another autobiography, if I could talk really great, called The Story of My Life. The Story of My Life. And many argue that that book, The Story of My Life, coming out around 1899 or 1900, was not nearly as successful because he didn't do the same things. Maybe he didn't sound so forgiving to white America. Maybe he didn't sort of make the same kind of jokes about African Americans, or sort of put the blame essentially on African Americans for their position. Right? Maybe he seemed a little more hostile, a little more holding a grudge. That book does not make it. Booker T sees how that first book flops and actually puts a bunch of money out to buy up all the copies so nobody will ever get to read it. Says, now make that one disappear. Let's put out this other one. Let's remix it. And it works. Can be super successful in terms of his success with uprooting slavery. So again, think about this as a political autobiography as you start thinking about the paper on Booker T. Washington. So those are some of the reasons why I say this is a political autobiography. Political autobiography. Let's put a little bit of context, though, on this discussion. I want to do it using PowerPoint as possible, and we'll come back to the handouts. So remember, this era is called the era of self-help. In many ways, it's also quite often called the era of Washington. It's so important that it seems to define this entire period from 1895 to about 1915. He is the man. He is the man. I told you, Booker T. Washington gets invited to the White House, I think in 1906. Teddy Roosevelt invites him to the White House to talk about these issues. He's the man. He's the one that, if you had any interest in the Negro problem, the African American problem, the race problem, you call Booker T. Washington to find out his thoughts. He gets invited to the White House to sit down and has dinner with Roosevelt, which causes a great outrage in the country. Because people are saying, how could you invite this African American, and they use other terms, N-word, this monkey, so on and so forth. This is a disgrace. Did y'all use the same silverware? Right? These kinds of letters get sent to the president. But in many ways, he defines this whole era, the era of self-help. Again, think about Washington's own background and how that may have translated into his program of self-help. Don't ask anybody else for help. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. In many ways, this defines a lot of folks in this time period. We see that Washington is going to take it to an extreme, maybe. Maybe he's just going to package it better and sell it better. So this blacks embrace an ideology of self-help. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be of service to the race. So not only are you pulling yourself up by improving yourself, but ultimately you're helping the entire race. Because if the larger society sees one, who's a raggedy, lazy, dirty black man, that stereotype gets put on everybody, right? There's this burden of representation. Yeah, in America, we want to be individuals. Everybody, we think we're all individuals. That shouldn't have anything to do with me. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it isn't. Right? And especially in this time period, you were a reflection of the larger society. Now, we've made some reference to education as a theme here, right? One of the ways that folks are going to help themselves immediately and initially is through education. So it's not a surprise that this whole Washington-Du Bois debate, much of it is going to center around competing notions of black education. But what's interesting here is that self-help figures into this. African Americans are largely responsible for their own education, paying for it, being the teachers. Now others are going to help, but largely it comes from within the African American community, and we see it work. There's a dramatic rise in African American literacy. Remember, 95% of African Americans are illiterate in 1865. Within a generation, a number of people are going to read. As Washington talks about, it was like a whole race going to school. You see more books and articles about African Americans, right? The notion of their history being important, people trying to reclaim that. Sort of supported by black and white donations and religious denominations, so often the churches get involved, but this could lead to some problems. What happens when someone's writing you a check? Does that mean they also have a say in what that education looks like? This is going to be a major issue. How do you balance white philanthropy for someone giving you a check from outside the community with your own ideas about self-determination, determining for yourself what that education should look like? What should kids be taught? So So those are key, and they're key to this Washington Du Bois debate. Racial self-determination is a key part. Blacks demand greater presence in the administration and faculties of white-run schools. Wait a second, if you're going to have African-American education, if you're going to have, say, numbers of white teachers coming down, should there also be black teachers? Should there also be black administrators? Some say, yeah. If we're really about equality, that should be the case, especially before we really see this strong separation of education where it really becomes illegal to have any sort of integration. Talk more about that. Black community is divided over the implications of self-help in relation to white-controlled colleges for blacks. You do have a number of institutions started by whites that help African Americans, schools like Wilberforce and Oberlin, for example. Howard, named after a white general. Should you have white teachers? Should you have black teachers only? Right? These are some of the questions that folks are going to have. Now, early on, that wouldn't be possible. In that first generation, you needed white support. You needed white teachers. There weren't that many black teachers. But over time, think about it today. Should an HBCU be all black? It's never been the case, right? If you walk around Blue State today, you'll see teachers of all nationalities, races, right, that are committed to an idea of education. Some people say, is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? We can think about it. But especially in this period where the context was so much different, right? It was maybe a much different issue at that time. Philanthropy, basically that big word meaning folks supporting African American efforts, especially educational efforts, with their checkbooks. So folks from outside the African American community that were willing to do so, whether they believed in education generally, maybe they believed in the necessity of African Americans being educated for whatever reason. This is a major source of support. Southern black schools began to receive money from large educational foundations. Right? Washington is going to be excellent at tapping into this money that's out there, right? And getting a lot of it channeled to Tuskegee. A lot of folks just start writing him checks and tell him, you disperse it. He becomes this sort of, I won't say gatekeeper because that has certain connotations to it, but he becomes the one you talk to, essentially, if you want to get involved in African American education. And overall, he may have actually increased white philanthropy, right? His message was such, right? This lack of bitterness, this idea that how do you solve the race problem where black people should just work harder? A lot of whites like that. Even whites that did not believe in equality or that maybe had some racist views themselves. They said, well, this guy has a good message. We'll give money to him. So maybe that helped overall African American education, even for those that may have disagreed with the Washington. So this last point is trying to illustrate that. Whites opposed outside philanthropy until it became clear that the philanthropists were not interested in promoting racial equality. So Washington was saying, look, I'm just trying to educate them in these basic skills, industrial education. I'm not trying to make them vote. I'm not trying to make them challenge their status, their position in society. It was a very non-threatening message that he's going to put out there. Yeah, does he believe all these things personally? Maybe that's a whole other issue. But in terms of what he put out there publicly, these folks are not going to challenge. There's a famous quote, I think it comes up in the Rise and Fall of Jim Crow video that you watch. There's a farmer that says, why should I send my maid to Tuskegee to learn how to cook? When she can spit in the skillet and tell if it's hot or not. Washington's response is, look, I'm trying to teach her not to spit in the skillet. I'm trying to be a better cook. Not really to ask why she can only be a cook in this society, but basically not spitting in the food to try to, to be better at what you're doing. So he says, I'm not trying to make African Americans not be farmers, try to be, governors or presidents or whatever, but I want them to be better farmers, more efficient farmers. So for many, especially in the white South that's trying to rebuild itself, they said, this is great. They're not challenging their status. They're willing to work within that status. So again, there's a politics attached to this education. Washington believes, though, this is the way to solve the race problem. And it works. This is a picture, pretty important picture from the chapter to show you some of the elbows that Mr. Washington is going to be rubbing. This is Booker T here. This is Andrew Carnegie, the famous steel magnate. One of Washington's really good friends. I told you last time, Carnegie writes many, many checks to Booker T. Washington and to Tuskegee. At one point, he writes him a check for $600,000, I think it is, and says, you never have to take a salary again. And this is what Washington does. He no longer takes a salary from Tuskegee. Washington spent a majority of his life and his 3 wives would spend the majority of their lives. The first 2 actually may have worked themselves to death at Tuskegee, out traveling getting money. They go especially to the north on trips, fundraising trips, to get money for Tuskegee. It was a constant money-making process. This is Carnegie, pretty important. William Howard Taft was actually president, and Ogden is another wealthy industrialist figure. So it sort of shows you some of the figures that Washington's. Again, former slave. Now, why would somebody like Carnegie be interested in that? Carnegie's going to be, the wealthiest guy in that country at one point. Why would somebody like him? Well, he's an immigrant. He was born an immigrant, comes to the United States broke, poor. Is this self-made man? Very American story. So you can see why maybe Andrew Carnegie might look at Washington and say, wow, he's kind of like me. He made himself powerful. He wasn't born into money. So you can see why some people might be drawn to this message. Educational inequality, right? We've talked about Plessy versus Ferguson, especially as once that's put in place, separate but equal. You're supposed to have separate but equal educational facilities. But we also mentioned how that doesn't happen, right? So you have, an African-American school perhaps, but they don't have any books, right? Whereas the white school has all these resources. So there's an educational inequality. Chapter 13 does a lot to talk about the status of that inequality. The South does not encourage equitable distribution. So how do public schools get paid for? Why are public schools in certain neighborhoods good? Public schools in other neighborhoods not so good. Even to this day, how do public schools get paid for? Taxes. Property taxes and others. So if you live in a wealthier area, there's more taxes being brought in, the schools can have better resources. If you live in an area where it's burned out, a lot of folks have left, right? Large unemployment rates, schools are not going to be as good. Public schools are not going to be as good. When I lived in LA, before I moved out here, there was a major lawsuit at Inglewood High School, where the Lakers used to play. Inglewood High School students decided to sue the school because they didn't have books. They didn't have any AP classes. And they said, how can we compete with all these other neighboring communities where students have access to all these AP classes and can get a 5.0, where it's not even possible for us to take AP classes and we don't have books or resources. So some of these educational inequalities persist.
Did they win the case?
I forgot what happened with the case. I remember it came up again because Steve Harvey had a radio show out there at the time, and so he ended up giving a lot of money for books and such, but I don't know in terms of institutional what happened with the case or what happened with the AP classes. Some schools have more than others, even to this day. So I have to go back and find out. That's a good question. And remember, too, once blacks are disfranchised, right, once the vote is gone, how are you going to defend yourself, right? Politicians don't care what you say because you can't vote. In addition to that, blacks are double taxed in support of black education. So in African-American neighborhoods, right, if you're paying your taxes, those tax dollars can be used for white schools. But then if you're an African-American parent, you also want the black school to have something, so you may have to pay double. Right? So what's interesting here is the community that has less, this is a recently freed community. They're not going to have a whole bunch of money as a group, yet they're being double taxed, in a sense. Higher education. As the number of graduates from institutions of higher education rose, so does the question of what type of education was appropriate. And this is sort of where Washington and Du Bois come in. The debate actually precedes them a little bit, but it's really going to pick up steam with these two figures. What type of education? Industrial training, which is what Hampton Institute had at the time. Remember, Washington goes to Hampton Institute. Remember, he walks there. Right? It's accepted. Is a mentee of Samuel Chapman Armstrong, right? So he learns about the importance of this industrial training, which seemed to fit with his life. He was a slave. He worked at a salt mine as a little kid. So for him, it makes perfect sense that hard work is going to pay off for him. Isn't it going to pay off for everybody else too? This industrial training idea is going to be ingrained in him. Pretty strong. Questions? No. The opposite of that is supposed to be this notion of the classical or liberal arts training. So whereas Hampton gets known for industrial training and Tuskegee is going to become known for industrial training, We had schools like Howard, here in D.C., and Fisk, that looked at more of a classical education, liberal arts training, right? This notion that you're not really educated until you're well-rounded. Think about your first 2 years here at Bowie State. Despite your major, a lot of you end up in the same classes, right? Maybe this class. You don't plan to be a history major, but somebody's making you take it. Why? Because the idea is that this makes you well-rounded, right? Whether you're going to be a scientist, actor, you need to have some sort of well-rounded education to participate in society and all this stuff. These are still, our ideas that it makes for a well-rounded, that's really what it means to be educated, you would say. But it's a debate. Washington is going to say, well, you don't need to take history. Let them take some other things. Let them take something more practical. Instead of sitting on these desks, they should learn how to make desks so they can have a job. And you can understand that, especially for a population recently free, looking for work, trying to keep their head above water, trying to not get lynched. Washington has reasons for what he's saying. He's a Southerner, whereas Du Bois was born in Massachusetts. Du Bois goes to Fisk University. This is a good chance to transition to Du Bois here. If you look at Du Bois' background on the worksheet, his background is very different than Washington's in some ways. Interesting though, Washington was born in slavery, becomes this very powerful figure, is going to be, secure financially. Du Bois is actually the opposite. He was born in Massachusetts in the north. He was born in 1868, so 3 years after slavery. He was born in Reconstruction, so he was never a slave. His mother, we think of Du Bois as kind of middle class or elite. And in many ways he is. He's going to get a decent education up there in Massachusetts. He wants to go to Harvard initially, but he's black, so he goes to Fisk at HBCU in Tennessee. That's his first sort of exposure to the South, to the Jim Crow South. Later, Du Bois is going to be the first African American to get his PhD from Harvard, so he does get to Harvard eventually. He's going to study in Germany for a couple of years, spoke languages. He's going to be a college professor. We talked about Du Bois once when we talked about the lynching. He was a professor at Atlanta University when that Sam Hose lynching happens. And so he's writing an article about it and then sees the knuckles on display and decides, you know what, I can't just be a teacher. I need to do something else to help the race. And this is when he really gets involved in sort of activism. Ultimately, he's going to be a founder of the NAACP and all of that. He's known for that. But his background's very different. Obviously, maybe your perspective is going to be very different. You were born a slave versus being born free. You're born in the South versus being born in the North. Maybe that explains in many ways their differing views. It is not that Du Bois thought that Washington was completely off base with industrial education. It's not that Du Bois was against industrial education. That's normally what you hear. Du Bois was against industrial education. What he did not like, what Du Bois had a problem with, with Washington was he believed that Washington was saying all African Americans should only be trained to work with their hands. Every African American, this is what you should do. You shouldn't be wasting your time studying history or Latin or any number of things. You should only be carpenters or better farmers or cooks. Du Bois found Washington's program to be too limiting, in some ways racist. Why are you going to limit a whole race to a certain level, economic level? Wasn't that he was against industrial education? But he said, African Americans, this is one of his famous phrases, is talented tenth. That's the term. That's on the next page. Okay, talented tenth. One of Du Bois' famous phrases was the talented tenth. He said, African Americans in some ways are just like any other racial group. There is at least 10% of them that have a higher level of talent and should be trained to use that talent. He said things like, the race is going to be saved by its exceptional men, and later exceptional men and women. He says, yeah, it's fine if you're a carpenter and that's great, get a job, but not everybody should be forced to. If a black person wants to be a lawyer, they should be allowed to do so. And this society doesn't really allow that. And Washington's program doesn't really allow that. It's too limiting. you're sort of feeding into, you're accommodating Jim Crow rather than fighting against Jim Crow. So, let's take it to a practical example. Du Bois said you have to resist Jim Crow, educate folks, especially this talented 10, because they're going to be ultimately the leaders of the race and pull everybody else up. Washington says accommodate Jim Crow for now, be patient, get a job, eventually you'll be respected, feed yourself economic power, right? Money is power kind of thing. Du Bois used this example. He said, look at sharecropping. Look at sharecropping. Du Bois' example was you cannot throw all your eggs in the basket of economic power. You have to have political power too. Du Bois said, look at sharecropping. If you can't vote or go to court, all those sharecroppers that work all year, right, and sign a labor contract, and at the end of the year they get ripped off, and they say, well, I'm going to sue you. Well, under all these black codes, you couldn't sue a white person. So Du Bois says, look, even your economic rights are not safe if you don't have political rights. Washington's view, you can understand it, right? Don't get lynched, basically. Washington saw himself as a realistic, look, I'm in the South. That Du Bois guy, he's way up in Massachusetts and New York, that's fine up there, but I'm in Tuskegee, Alabama. Right? When he comes down here and sees what's really going on, and maybe he'll have a different view. Du Bois said it doesn't matter where you are. You have to constantly resist strife and struggle. He always uses the term strife and struggle, particularly around this notion of the talented 10. Initially, though, Du Bois, for example, Washington's 1895 Atlanta speech with the whole 5 fingers that we talked about. Initially, Du Bois says, that was great. You did a great job. He sends him a telegram. It's a great speech. You hit it out the park. He says it was a word fitly spoken. Others, Ida Wells and others that later become critics of Washington say, congratulations. I don't know how you did that. You got up there, they were booing you, right? I don't know how you said what you said, but where whites in the audience heard what they wanted, blacks heard what they wanted, and you became the man. Later on, though, he looks at this as, he calls it the Atlanta Compromise. This is the moment where Washington kind of sold out the African-American population. He's going to, in some ways, allow something like Plessy versus Ferguson to pass the very next year, because this was a black figure saying that segregation was okay. I'm very critical of Washington later on. Particularly when talented 10 figures like Du Bois, remember Du Bois is going to be one of the best educated humans of any color at this time. Fisk, PhD from Harvard, studied in Germany. He writes one of the first books in American sociology called The Philadelphia Negro in 1900, seen as one of the fathers of American sociology, fathers of Pan-Africanism, history, all these things. Yet Du Bois his whole life had difficulty holding jobs and paying his own bills. So it looked like Du Bois was this whole middle-class elite figure. He walked around with a little top hat and a cane and stuff, and he looked the part. But there are letters from Du Bois' wife like, hey, you can't pay the bills, man. Whereas Washington looked the common man. He had access to all kinds of funds. So it's interesting to think about the kind of real versus what appearance.
So with the talented 10, I was able to basically give special provisions to be able to further their talents. What do you mean by that?
That essentially they shouldn't be limited. He says he would say just like the white population, the African American population has a certain group within that population that should be allowed, should be provided access to higher education, classical education. We shouldn't make everybody go to a training school. But there are some students that are intelligent enough, going to work hard enough, they can do it. The only reason he said they're being limited is because of their race. He said that's the same thing with whites. There are some that are smart enough to do that, and that's their talent. There are some that aren't. I have a PhD in history. I couldn't get an MD degree. I can't do blood. I'd be in there trying to do surgery on somebody and pass that. I couldn't do it. No matter how much you pay me, that's just not my talent. Never will be. It's just not me. I have friends that can do that. So just like anybody else, you have individual talents, right? And that our talents as an African American group are limited just because of racism. Now again, that gets interpreted. Like a lot of folks say his plan, Du Bois' plan is elitist, and he's only thinking about 10% of the African American population, whereas Washington's plan is for everybody. So that's one way this is read. That was never Du Bois' thing. Actually, about 25 years later, after he first puts this term out in Souls of Black Folk, he writes another article about the Talented Tenth, and he's actually very disappointed in the Talented Tenth, because by the 1930s, there is a black middle class created, just as Du Bois had envisioned. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, large numbers of artists. He says they haven't done what I wanted them to do. They were supposed to make it, get college educated, and then pull up everybody else. They were supposed to make it easier for the rest of the community. He says they pulled themselves up and then separated themselves. So his vision was that this group will become a small, powerful leadership group that helps everybody else out. Washington, in a sense, kind of maybe knew that would happen. He said, you know what, if you help one little group, that's the only group that's going to help. So it's an interesting argument again, then and now. You think about this notion of a middle class black community. Do they have a certain responsibility to the working class? Do they not? It's up for debate. So this Talented Tenth debate is a debate. There's one of the documents on the blackboard is by Henry Morehouse Howard. He's the one that really he's one of the figures that really kind of coins this term, Talented Tenth. Du Bois would popularize it, but there's a short, I think, two-page article on the Talented Tenth in that folder of blackboard under Washington Du Bois debate. It kind of lays out what the Talented Tenth is, but we've talked about what it is right here. So look at the handout. Let's get a little bit more on Du Bois, because there's some important stuff here. Remember, both of them are Washington and Du Bois. They're talking about education for the most part. They're talking about politics. I would say the main question they're both answering is how should you respond to the race problem? How should you respond to the race problem? So under major themes, Du Bois, the color line. The color line, I don't really have a chalkboard, much of a chalkboard in here. Put a quick diagram up, but I don't think that's going to be possible. But basically, the color line is the term that Du Bois coins in Souls of Black Folk. One of the most famous lines from this book. He says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. That's why I say he's responding to this question of how do you respond to the race problem. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. What he meant basically was there's a line down society that divides black and white. Black and white. And there's a line in between them. Really interesting metaphors he would use. English majors can really sort of get with this. Souls of Black Folks, one of those classic books that they still read, not just in history class, where he talks about things like the Freedmen's Bureau and Reconstruction and Washington, but also the literary style that he uses is pretty crazy. He's going to throw a lot of metaphors up there, a lot of terms that we can use to understand the race problem. One of them is his metaphor of this color line. He says that the color line is like a veil, V-E-I-L. Color line is like a veil, V-E-I-L. What's a veil? When we know, think of a veil today, what is a veil? The wedding day, the bride has this veil on, right, covers her face, you can't see her. And think about the metaphor that he's going to use. It makes some sense. He says, here's the color line, here's the white community, here's the black community. He says this color line is like a veil between them. They can't see each other. They can't see each other. All right, so the bride's walking down the aisle before she pulls it up. You can't see her. So he says blacks and white can't really see each other. Early on, Du Bois said this is why there's a race problem. Ignorance. We don't know each other. We can't see each other. We can't talk. We can't communicate. Early on, Du Bois is fairly optimistic that if we could just break down that line, if folks could see how each other lives and get to know each other, there wouldn't be racism. The reason why there's racism is because of ignorance. Now later on, Du Bois says maybe that was the case. Maybe there's some larger problems on class and all these other things. But early on, he says this veil is the problem. But the veil is interesting. If we think about the wedding metaphor again, right? When the bride's walking down the aisle, you can't see her face. But she can see you, right? You can see where she's walking, thankfully. I'll be like on those videos on YouTube where folks are falling out. So he says this veil works actually a couple of different ways. You got a veil here, color line, white communities over here, white imagined community we could say, black imagined communities here. He says there's a whole bunch of stuff going on behind the scenes, behind the veil. So a lot of this book, he talks about taking people behind the veil. Half of Souls of Black Folk, the audience of it, is written to African Americans. He's saying, look, this is who we are. This is our soul. half of it, you could say, is written towards the white community. Talking about racism and its difficulties. He says, there's a lot going on behind the scenes, behind the veil. Some have said he describes a counter veil. He says African Americans actually know white people better than white people know African Americans. Do you think that's true? He says African Americans know the white community, the mainstream society, as it said. African Americans know mainstream society better than mainstream society knows African Americans. That's true today? Why? Why would that be true?
You mean today?
Yeah.
Not today, no.
No? But then you would say?
Yeah, back then. Not now, because of diversity. We all know each other now.
All know each other pretty well. That line has been broken down. But you could
The
understand.
line's still there, but it's just, we see, like, we have a perspective.
Yeah, a lot more. Yeah, I think the boys would be amazed in some ways at how that, much of that ignorance has been broken down. That color line has never really been, it's been like a dotted line, right? You've always had stuff going on back and forth. What he says, though, is that was intentional. Especially at this time. He says it's intentional. He says African Americans have to know mainstream society better than just to stay alive. Remember all the stuff we talked about, the kind of random rules of Jim Crow, right? This notion that if you're walking down the street, you gotta get off the sidewalk or you get killed. Right? Black men cannot look a white woman in the face ever. Are these sort of unwritten rules that folks were taught from their youth that Emmett Till didn't know, right? That's why he gets killed. So he says, look, this counter veil, this veil has made it necessary that folks learn. It was a matter of life and death to learn these lessons. Whereas the mainstream society didn't have to worry about that, right? They can learn what they want. They can learn about, say, hip-hop culture, or learn about jazz music, or, any NFL, right? So you can learn what you want to learn, but you don't have to. There's no incentive for you to have to, he would say. So this veil is a really interesting metaphor. Think about, whether you think about that, or whether you agree with that or not. That was a lot of his view here. So that the quotes, major themes. Problem of the 20th century, the problem of the color lines, whether that was one of his most famous phrases. This notion of the talented tenth, we've talked about what that is. The veil, we've talked about that. Double consciousness, probably the second most famous term, and it fits this discussion we're having. He says African Americans have a certain double consciousness. African Americans have a certain double consciousness, which means they have to think about themselves and their identity in complicated ways. Again, it's a matter of life and death that they do this. Now, this is not all good. And Cardi says it's good, that behind this veil, they've learned to see white America without letting white America fully see them. So, for example, you're someone's butler, or you're having a horrible day. You come in, you're in a bad mood, but you're the butler. As soon as you see the person you work with, hey, how you doing? Things are great. You go back home, I hate that. I'm tired. He smells funny, right? There's a different conversation that may happen behind closed doors that happens. Why? It has to, right? You want to keep your job, you want to stay safe. Or let's talk about it in contemporary terms. A lot of us have conversations with each other, and all of a sudden your phone rings in class, and you go outside to answer. It's a job. It's a job. Manager of the employer that you want to work for is calling. How does your voice sound in comparison to how it might sound when you're talking to your phone?
We're using slang, we're speaking as clearly as possible.
Enunciate. I do the same thing, right? Enunciate. Why? Why can't they just accept you for how you might be on a Friday night as opposed to on a Tuesday morning?
Because they're trying to get that job, they want to impress upon them, like you have to get, feel like you have the right business type.
You need to fit, you need to fit a certain model, especially say you're working customer service or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, again, I'm not saying that's good or bad. The boys would say that's a great trait. That's a skill. Y'all are all bilingual, right? Able to speak a variety of languages based on the situation. Variety of languages. And this is not just about race, but this is what the people that we're talking about. I went to school in LA for 13, 14 years. My first roommate in college is Cat Jose. Still one of my best friends to this day. We've been through everything together. He's my other brother. I mean, call him a friend anymore. Everything from both my roommates right here got kicked out. And it's not because they weren't smart. Jose is much smarter than me to this day. fix anything into science or whatever. It has some stuff, it has some issues. I noticed when I go home, since I met Jose first, a lot of the first cats I met in UCLA were Latino. I go home, I start talking faster than I talk here. I get a bit of a Spanish accent, especially when Jose starts going kind of this bad language. I apologize, but that's how we tend to talk to each other. It changes. I tend to actually change in a variety of situations. I get comfortable. Again, that's not foreign. No, everybody does that in some level. It's not the same way I would talk to my mom, right? The same way I would talk. It's just it changes. There's certain intonations, and that's not even for any purpose. You're not paying me, right? But I think the job example works because we all understand that we need to make a certain amount of our right? And once you get comfortable, then you can do whatever you want to do. But this is what Du Bois is saying is a necessary skill that is developed in this imagined community. You might show a certain face to the larger society when you choose to, but you don't always show that same face. You don't always show it all. This is what double consciousness is. A couple of quotes here. Look at quote number 3 under major themes Du Bois. He says, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others." He says African Americans always are looking at themselves through someone else, not just about how you are, who you are as an individual. That'd be great if that's all it was. If I were American, you want to be an individual. But you knew, especially at this time, the other society, the mainstream society, is seeing you in a certain way. So you may not have, and some of this maybe applies today. We talk about, some recent issues around police brutality and whatnot, right? Maybe you've never committed a crime in your life. Walking down the street, you should have perfect confidence that you're good, right? Cop goes by, why you get nervous? You didn't do anything. Well, you know that perhaps you're not being viewed as your true self, right? You might be viewed in a number of ways. So you get a little nervous. Viewing yourself through the eyes of others. Not that it's a good thing. He says, Du Bois talks about this as almost like a disease. You kind of have to view yourself, not just as who you know you are, but how others might see you. Double consciousness. Really good quote about it, right? Measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American and Negro, 2 souls, 2 thoughts, 2 unreconciled strivings, 2 warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Some people have broken this down into what Du Bois, this in a problem of the hyphen. Problem of the hyphen is some folks have called it. What do we mean by that? Hyphen with the dash. Du Bois is talking about being both African and American at the same time. What is an African American identity? And we started the year with this, right? Trying to complicate this notion of Black or African American identity. That still helps us with this conversation. Du Bois says, folks are trying to figure out how do you do that? You're both African and American at the same time. There's a hyphen in between there, right? There's almost a tension. You're being pulled in different directions. That was Du Bois' view. Washington's view was like, there's no problem. There's no problem with the hyphen. Now you solve that. Cut that hyphen. Just be American. Don't worry about the African side. Let all that go. And so, Washington would sometimes talk about, heathen Africa and not being religious and no culture. He would use those sort of stereotypes to make his point that we're just American now. Again, think about the message. Mainstream America may have liked that message better. Du Bois says you can't do that. You can't cut off half yourself and all your ancestry. And why should you? Every other American can be hyphenated. Italian American, you'd be proud of being from Italy or Ireland, and a village near Galway, or something. You have a certain history. That's power. Du Bois would say African Americans should be able to rely on that power as well. Why should they cut themselves off? Washington says they should.
Du Bois eventually moved to Africa, didn't he?
Yes, he does. The last 2 years of his life, he moves to Ghana, which is going to become independent. First African nation to gain independence. He actually dies there and is buried in Ghana, West Africa. So it gives you some sense of how he may have become disillusioned with America after living 95 years. Du Bois lives a long time. Born in 1868. He actually dies the morning of the March on Washington speech. So when King gave the I Have a Dream speech, right before that they had announced that the old man had died.
That's an interesting time.
It really is. The timing was really interesting. All of those figures are a great debt, and acknowledge that great debt. Because think about it. Think about Martin Luther King. He's going to challenge Jim Crow, something that Du Bois said we had to do 60 years earlier. So in some ways, this debate defines the entire century. Yes.
Did they mention it? In the Marshall?
Yeah, they do mention it. They found out right as it was happening, and so they made note of that. They had a moment of silence and everything. Yep. Even though he was no longer in the country, there's long shadow, as they said, was still very much a carry. Now again, this isn't, this whole Washington Du Bois debate isn't completely what it seems. Washington is saying don't teach them science, don't worry about these higher thinking. This is a picture of the Tuskegee laboratory at Tuskegee. One of the teachers at Tuskegee was George Washington Carver. Brilliant scientist, all kinds of things with the peanut, all that. Right? So there were some other things going on at Tuskegee too, as with many African American schools. Sometimes they would only show you the manual training. A number of women, for example, Charlotte Hawkins Brown in North Carolina is one. And when whites came around, they said, okay, we'll do carpentering today. As soon as they left, they started studying Greek and Latin and French. So sometimes you had to hide it. You were going to get those checks, then you educate the way you wanted to. So it's interesting, again, even to think about some place like Tuskegee that's going to produce even a full number of teachers that later teach in some of the other schools. So some of this debate was, again, just that, just a debate, a sort of public debate. That second quote is interesting too. It's kind of like this veil and double consciousness again. It says, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields to him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. That same idea about the veil and double consciousness and the color line and such. So for Du Bois, under that comparison of racial philosophies, that part in the middle, if we're going to rank his order of priorities and how you solve the race problem, number one for Du Bois would be politics. Whereas politics was last for Washington, politics, he says you have to have political rights, you have to struggle, even if it costs you your life. Education, I put second for him, and it was a particular type of education, classical liberal education. And then last, economics. He says you can't even defend your economic rights without being full citizens, so you have to fight for those sorts of rights. This part of the PowerPoint is something we've seen. Talk about Washington and his background, 1895, Atlanta speech, the five-finger speech and all that. Up from slavery, we just talked about that a lot. Talked about there's two positions where Washington may have upset folks. He makes a speech in Chicago that didn't quite sound like Washington. For example, as lynching, remember, Washington comes up during this era of lynchings. He knew all about lynchings happening in the South. He really mostly refused to comment on it. He'd say, they must have done something. A lot of folks are pushing him to comment. Again, Washington knew. Even what he was doing in terms of his educational model could have been seen as radical. One of Washington's friends, who started a school, gets shot because he's educating people. Right? So he knew that he was walking a kind of fine line. And he says, look, this is how I'm going to do it. If I get killed, all this work is for nothing. Then Roosevelt that pissed folks off. Behind the scenes, there was a public Washington. There may have also been a private Booker T. Washington. So publicly, he's saying, don't fight Jim Crow. Don't worry about it. Don't try to vote. Privately, all these checks that Washington was receiving, evidence has come out since the 1970s. And he used some of that money to finance court cases against Jim Crow. So even as he was saying, don't fight, don't worry, don't trust trouble, he might have been taking some of this money that he was getting with that public face and with books like Up From Slavery and using it against racism. Yeah, you guys tell me what it was a good thing about. I'm saying this is what happened. At the time, he's saying, don't worry, you guys are foolish if you trouble with all this. He's getting the checks. And he's using some of this money to finance Jim. And Du Bois and others knew about some of this. Okay, they didn't out him because to out him would have cut out his money. They knew he was doing certain things that are going to help people ultimately. But what does it say? Does it say that he didn't believe any of the other stuff? I don't know. It's up to you. So you decide what that means. But it's a fact. It's a fact that some of these things may not have fit with his public. Some people said that Washington was a black politician. What do politicians do? They have something they say publicly. They have their own private beliefs that may have been very different. So what do you think? What do you think about this debate? Some of the ways that I usually ask this question are, whose plan is more realistic? Who was more successful? There are any number of ways to ask this question. There, on the back of the handout, as you consider Washington and his critics, right? This debate could be asked in a number of ways. Most of his critics didn't necessarily have a problem with industrial education. Like I said, they had a problem with Washington's use of his power. I said, if you criticize Washington, he would shut you down. You lose your job, you close down the presses, he could destroy you. Did so on several occasions to various individuals. Monroe Trotter in Massachusetts, during one of Washington's speeches, stands on a chair and is heckling him. Monroe Trotter is thrown in jail. Right, 1905, 1906, Du Bois and other critics get together and are starting an organization that ultimately is going to challenge Washington's power. Washington writes various white newspapers and says, "Nah, ignore them. Don't give them any press." He calls some hotels and says, "Don't let them meet there." These folks had to go all the way to Niagara Falls, Canada. They go to the Canadian side so they could find a hotel to meet. Because Washington had kind of shut it down. He didn't want any challenges to him because he felt like he had the plan, the program. So these are some of the criticisms that have come with Washington. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I would say both of them were right, but they had different plans. So how to get there. So.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Both of them, and this is a good point. Both of them feel like they are right. Both of them feel like they had the best plan that would ultimately help the race. And so the other person is seen as an enemy of that. Not just personally, although some of this is going to get personal, but it's about, they felt like it was a matter of life and death. Folks are literally being killed. Folks are having their opportunities limited. You have to take a certain stand. They both believe that their stand is right. I would say that definitely both of them feel like they are right. And so their plan is very serious to them. This was not just a sort of exercise and intellectual sort of debate. It was a matter of life and death, both of them believe. So what do you think? Whose plan?
I think Washington was more successful.
I think more successful? How come?
Because like even though like he was saying like rape white people and stuff, he was still getting what he needed to help us at the same time.
He definitely has built something. Tuskegee exists to this day, right? When better HBCUs, what they call the Tuskegee machine. So it wasn't just about the school. This is like a whole political machine that he develops. Right? He's able to dole out resources and whatnot. He is the most powerful African American figure in the country.
I'd probably say that maybe both plans are probably the best, because certain elements from them, you still have a good plan out of it, and both men are still widely remembered to this day, especially for their plans for success.
So both figures are still remembered. That tells you something about their relevance. You say they could have mixed it, right? They could have somehow mixed it together.
I think Du Bois would have been more successful if he waited a little more after slavery.
Okay.
Like, he just enslaved, and now you're trying to do all this extra stuff. You need to wait so white people can process everything that's going on.
Interesting. So the timing might have been bad. He might have been moving too quick, too much too quick. Okay.
I see it kind of like taking France towards the end and getting closer kind of thing in regards to Washington.
Okay.
Because granted, in the past, all this violence didn't really turn out to anything but it just makes situations even worse. I think Washington was really actually studying the enemy and kind of befriending them in a type of a frenemy, in a type of way, and kind of really studying and making them, hear what they want to hear, but in reality, they both really agreed. It's just that one was sloppy at it and the other one was more wise about it and kind of sneaky, really.
Interesting. I like that. I like that. For your papers, right? These are exactly the ideas that you're going to have to debate and discuss. let me say a couple things I want to say. This essay here is going to count for part of the midterm. It's not a separate assignment from the midterm. This is what we're going to actually do. You have a study guide now for the chapter 12 stuff. You seen that? We can talk about that a little more. We'll talk about that Thursday. That was supposed to be Thursday. That's going to be next Tuesday, 17th. We'll take that in class the 17th. We can talk about it on Thursday. This part is going to be submitted via Dropbox on the 17th. And that will be your midterm. That will be your midterm, no separate midterm. So the midterm is going to be the chapter 12 multiple choice, those identifications, which I want to say a little bit about, and this essay. The essay will be turned in to the Dropbox. There won't be a separate midterm assignment. Does that make sense? So basically, you're responsible for up to 13. I know we're into chapter 14 in terms of reading and stuff now, but